The man known to history as both Henry Bolingbroke and King Henry IV of England was born on the 15th of April 1367 at Bolingbroke Castle, Lincolnshire, England. His father was John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, who was born on the 6th of March 1340 in Ghent, in what is today Belgium. He was the third son of King Edward III and his wife, Philippa of Hainault. Henry's mother was Blanche of Lancaster, the daughter of Henry of Grosmont, 1st Duke of Lancaster, and his wife Isabel of Beaumont. She was born in March 1345 at Bolingbroke Castle. John of Gaunt and Blanche were third cousins, both descended from King Henry III. They married on the 19th of May 1359 at Reading Abbey in Berkshire, when she was only 14 and he 19. She gave John 7 children, but only 3 survived to adulthood: Philippa, born in 1360, Elizabeth in 1364, and Henry in 1367. John of Gaunt grew up overshadowed by his more militarily illustrious older brother, Edward of Woodstock, also known as the Black Prince, and the heir to the English throne. Although both John and Edward had served in important battles, John's efforts proved a disappointment to his father. Yet, fate had a different plan for John. His brother Edward developed an inexplicable wasting disease, suffering from it for 8 years. He died in 1376 before he could ascend to the throne. Edward only had one son, Richard, who was 10 years old when he became king after Edward III died the following year. As the young king's uncle and a leading member of the royal family, John did his best to provide a moderating force for his nephew, even taking on the role of peacemaker as Richard's behavior became increasingly more erratic. It could be said that John's greatest achievement was to keep not only himself, but his son and heir Henry alive through the tumultuous years of Richard II's reign. Henry Bolingbroke entered the world during uncertain times. In many ways, his reign was a transitional period from the societal chaos of the Middle Ages to the beginnings of modern statecraft and nation-building. His birth occurred during a brief lull in one of the longest periods of conflict between France and England, known to us as the 100 Years' War, which began in 1337 and ended in 1453. In addition to tensions with France, England experienced birthing pains as it evolved not only into a nation, but also struggled to create a reliable, responsive government. Since the difficult reign of King John, the kingdom suffered through a roller coaster of powerful nation-building kings such as Edward I and Edward III, interspersed with weak, recalcitrant kings such as Henry III, Edward II, and Richard II, who nearly brought the country to civil war. Surrounding regions like Wales and Scotland also asserted their nationhood, leading to continued conflicts with England. In addition, in 1378 the Catholic Church split, creating 2 seats of power and 2 popes, one still in Rome and the other in Avignon. The Great Papal Schism upset the established hierarchy that had held medieval Europe together. In this vacuum, people began to question aspects of Catholic practice, such as transubstantiation. Groups such as the Lollards in England, led by John Wycliffe, actively protested the excessive involvement of clergy in temporal affairs. They presented what they called the 12 Conclusions, which demanded reform and greater transparency within the church. The general populace had to not only brave the ravages of war and religious uncertainty, but also had to endure repeated plagues, famines, extreme weather, and economic dislocation due to population fluctuations and the destruction of war. The people began to demand a more transparent and responsive government. One way of achieving this came by implementing provisions found in the Magna Carta that served as the foundation for a new royal advisory system called The Parliament. As the country moved into the 15th century, Parliament continued to increase its influence on how government functioned. Yet, there was a downside to this advance. In its effort to address financial shortfalls created by decades of war, it imposed more taxes on the populace. In response, artisans and the poor determined they had nothing to lose and decided to make their voices heard against this tax abuse. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was the first protest of its kind and caught the government of King Richard II completely off guard. Although the protesters vented their spleen by killing those leaders believed responsible for their suffering, it largely failed as a political movement. However, the king increasingly had to work with Parliament, which began to demand more accountability of the crown to the people. Both Richard II and Henry IV encountered the challenges of the changing meaning of royal prerogative. It was their responses to this threat of change that determined the success or failure of their reign. Richard responded vindictively and wielded autocratic power. Henry determined it best to accommodate this change and worked with Parliament to navigate the violent waters of the early 15th century to arrive battered but safe on a rocky shore. His son, Henry V, benefited greatly from the moderating force of his father's actions during his turbulent reign. Henry Bolingbroke's early life began surrounded by his two older sisters and the extended Lancaster family. His great-aunt, Blanche Lady Wake, looked after the three children until they were old enough to begin formal education. Henry did not know his mother because she died a year after his birth. From an early age, he heard stories about not only his beautiful, charming mother, but of the chivalric exploits of his great-grandfathers, grandfathers, uncles, and other relatives. He played with children of noble families who would grow up to be key political players during his lifetime, including his cousins, John and Thomas Mowbray, Henry Percy, who was also known as Hotspur, Thomas and Ralph Percy, and Richard and Thomas Arundel. Henry rarely saw his father until 1371, when he returned with his new bride Constanza of Castile. Henry was transferred to her household until 1374, when his father felt it time for him to begin his formal education. John appointed Henry Burton as his son's governor. Burton served as Henry's martial teacher to prepare him to take up the chivalric mantle of his ancestors. John also assigned chaplain Hugh Hurl as Henry's academic tutor and religious guide. Henry learned quickly and became proficient in reading and writing not only Latin, but also English and French. He developed a love of music, books, and learning, and true to his familial heritage, he excelled at the martial arts. Henry's life was relatively idyllic and secure until the succession crisis hit around 1376, as the Black Prince neared death. The question became who should succeed Edward III, since his heir apparent was about to die, and his only son was just a minor. Should the inheritance run through each child's line, meaning that the throne could be inherited through the female line, or should it only pass through the male line? And should a minor inherit the throne? It was determined that young Richard would inherit. Parliament then voted John, the eldest in the male line, as King's Lieutenant to hold the Parliament. The Black Prince made his father and John promise to support his son's right to the throne. John, a man who believed in duty, promised and never reneged from it, even when his nephew tried to harm him and his family years later. Once the Black Prince had died, John was able to convince his father to keep the line of inheritance through the male line only, effectively removing the descendants of his brother Lionel's daughter Philippa, the Mortimers, from the inheritance. However, this ruling was not made public, causing problems years later. Henry, along with some of his playmates, entered Richard's court in 1376. It must have been strange for Richard to be thrown into a group of children who had known each other for years. He had led a lonely, sheltered life and must have felt awkward in his new surroundings and role. He also had not been trained in the knightly ways like the other boys, leading to feelings of jealousy and alienation. On the 23rd of April 1377, Richard, Henry, and 10 other young men received an honor created by Edward III. They were knighted and nominated into the Knights of the Garter. 2 months later, King Edward III of England was dead. Richard was born on the 5th of January 1367 in Bordeaux, France. He was just 3 months older than Henry, and only 10 when he ascended to the throne. Like all coronations, it was a magnificent affair filled with pageantry. Henry participated by having the honor to hold the katana, a blunt-tipped sword of mercy once wielded by St. Edward the Confessor. Richard relied heavily on his counselors during those early years of his kingship. However, in 1380, Parliament chose to put an end to their corrupting influence. Even so, they had not acted swiftly enough, as anger swelled among the populace over the ever-increasing tax burden. What became known as the Peasants' Revolt began in May 1381 in Kent and Essex. As the rebel numbers swelled, they moved towards London. Their goal was to destroy the king's hated advisors and other lords of the realm, including John of Gaunt and Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry and his guardians, along with Richard and his government, moved to the protection of the Tower of London. John of Gaunt was in the north, fighting the Scots. The rabble moved through London, destroying John's great palace called the Savoy, and left a path of destruction in their wake as they moved towards the Tower of London. On the 13th of June, Richard headed out of the Tower with his entourage to negotiate with the rebels. Although he claimed sympathy for their plight, he could not offer them what they wanted, but instead encouraged them to take justice for themselves. The next morning, Richard made his way out of the tower, leaving those who remained to their fate, including Henry, as the rabble stormed the fortress. Many key governmental officers were killed during the foray, including the Archbishop of Canterbury. If it had not been for a knight by the name of John Farrar, who spoke up for the young nobleman, Henry's head would have wound up on a spike. It can be said that in many respects, this was the defining moment in the relationship between Richard and Henry. Richard believed he had proven himself kingly by his actions and could rule as he willed. Henry learned he could never trust his cousin, because he had been willing to let others die while he fled to safety. By early 1381, John had taken control of Henry's education and began to groom his young son to be a prince of the realm. John first ensured he had a suitable marriage. His bride was Mary Bowen, only 11 years old. She came from an important family whose lands had been under the care of John's younger brother, Thomas of Woodstock, also known as the Duke of Gloucester. While Gloucester wanted to send Mary to a nunnery to gain these lands for himself, John determined it would be better for his son Henry to benefit from them instead. Mary and Henry were married on the 5th of February, 1381, at Rochford Hall in Essex. She remained with her mother for another 4 years, after which Henry and she began to live together. It was a good match, some would say a love match, for they both shared a fondness for fine books and music. She gave birth to 6 children in 8 years, and Henry did not seem to look for love elsewhere during this marriage. She died in Peterborough Castle in 1394, giving birth to their last daughter, Philippa. She was buried at the Church of St. Mary de Castro in Leicester. Her death hit Henry hard, and it would take him several years to remarry. John also taught Henry how to behave like a prince. including the importance of loyal behavior to his sovereign, even in adversity, how to dress as a prince, how to show charity to the poor, and how to honor God and the church. Henry grew to be a man of reason, a lover of order and logic. One chronicler, Capgrave, described him as a man who had a tenacious memory and enjoyed a good debate over issues of morality. In January 1382, Henry participated in the jousting tournament at Smithfield to celebrate the coronation of Richard's new queen, Anne of Bohemia. Henry was one of the youngest participants at only 14. He not only dressed himself in style, but he also proved himself one of the best fighters in the land. This only heightened Richard's jealousy of his cousin. As a result of the peasants' revolt and the teachings of his tutor Sir Simon Burley, Richard believed a good king must demonstrate absolute control over his realm. He began to see King Edward II as his preferred model for how to rule, not his grandfather Edward III. His first act was to surround himself with his favorite courtiers who would tell him what he wanted to hear. Next, he began to break the power of people like his uncle John by acting in ways contrary to customary practice. For example, when the Earl of March, Edmund Mortimer, husband to the daughter of Lionel, Duke of Clarence, died in 1381, rather than hold the properties in trust for the heirs, he proceeded to distribute the lands to his favorites. When one minister protested, he was removed from office, a highly irregular move that shocked the court. Richard was clever and had a supple mind that could run rings around those who tried to argue with him. Therein lay the danger. Henry saw what was happening around him as opposition to Richard's rule of favorites grew. At the 1383 Parliament, those in attendance told Richard he had poor advisers and he must remove them. Richard would have none of it and began to see any opposition as a slight. Henry watched his father navigate these troubled waters because, although John sympathized with Richard's opponents, he had to uphold his promise to his brother to help his nephew. John also had a second consideration: to protect his only son and his inheritance. He tried to keep his son out of much of the controversy for now, and he indeed had reason to be concerned. For example, a friar named John Latimer told Richard that John was planning to assassinate him, and when John found out, he ran to the king to declare his innocence. In response, Richard had the friar arrested, tortured, and killed. Mutterings of frustration grew to the point that many in the realm began to question Richard's fitness to be king. This made things even more difficult for John, who continued to try to appease the king and to retain his favor. By the end of 1384, things had become so bad in England, with the Scots rebelling in the north and war looming in France, that tensions had reached a boiling point. Henry watched as his family came increasingly under attack. For example, John announced that he would lead a force into France, but this was against the wishes of the king. John was then blamed for the situation because of the failings of the peace treaty that he had helped negotiate. Publicly rebuked, John and his two brothers stormed out. Insulted, Richard plotted to assassinate John, but the Duke of Lancaster was warned in time and managed to escape harm. 10 days later, he marched into the hall where Richard was sitting and presented a blistering critique of Richard and his government, declaring that he could no longer serve such a king. Richard's mother broke into tears and pleaded with Richard to make amends with his uncle. He did so a few days later, but John never trusted Richard again. Everyone attending the Parliament of 1385 knew it was going to be an intense session. The Lords presented their complaints to the king in 13 clauses that could be summed up as Richard must seek advice from his council and follow it. He must obey the law. He could no longer dispense lands and grants without advice, and pardons could not be granted wantonly, as he had done previously. After much debate, it was decided that all financial decisions would be made under a commission of 4 to monitor distribution, which Richard weakened through parliamentary maneuvers, and then distributed lands and titles to his favorites anyway. This angered those in attendance. Ignoring their howls of protest, Richard reached out to John, giving him permission to leave England to pursue his rights to Castile via his marriage to Constanza. During his preparations, John prepared his son to step into his shoes to manage the interests of the Lancaster family in his absence. On the 9th of July, 1386, Henry said goodbye to his father. Henry soon found himself faced with the challenges his father had managed until now, most importantly navigating Richard and his whims. He rightly chose initially to stay away from court, and instead headed home in time to see his first son, Henry, born on the 16th of September 1386. Even so, events pointed him in the direction of Westminster. The French threatened to invade England, but when the king announced at Parliament that October that he would lead an army to France, it refused to grant him the right of taxation, explaining that he had failed to heed their advice and refused to act in accordance with their directives. Furious, Richard stormed out of the chamber while those in attendance remained with the Duke of Gloucester, leading the opposition. The gathering began to determine the best course of action and decided it was time to propose the deposition of the king. Gloucester and Thomas Arundel, the Bishop of Ely, were chosen to report this decision to the king. When told, Richard rebuffed this report by saying that he would rather seek the aid of his cousin in France against his enemies than cave to Parliament. For Gloucester, these were fighting words. Over the next few days, Parliament pored over legal documents to see how Edward II had been deposed. It had become clear to everyone that Richard was unfit to rule. When told to return to Parliament, Richard agreed that he had planned a trap. He pointed out that the most likely candidate to succeed him was in Spain, and there was no guarantee he was coming back, and the primary alternative was still a child. Is that what the Parliament wanted? A child king? This revelation stymied the assembly, for it implied that Roger Mortimer, a child, had been declared Richard's true heir. For Henry, it proved earth-shattering. After this shock, Richard then agreed to a commission of 14 to manage his government for 1 year. Henry was not selected for this committee and returned home confused and angry, but he did not express it. He had learned from his father's example to keep his true feelings secret. Richard chose to play along with the decision, knowing that the committee's rule would be over in a year or less if he could find a way to disable it. In August 1387, Richard asked some judges to investigate if the actions of Parliament were legal. He wanted them to provide the answers that he desired, and those judges who refused did so, facing threats of death, so they affixed their seal. Richard then presented this document declaring that Parliament only had an advisory role and could grant permission for taxation, but could not order the king to do anything. Richard went so far as to revoke Edward III's Statute of Treason from 1352. Unease filled the realm as the end of the Commission of 14 approached. Richard then ordered the arrest of the Duke of Gloucester and other lords of the realm, only to find that they had armed themselves against him. Even Thomas Mortimer, guardian of Roger Mortimer and Richard's preferred heir to the throne, took up arms. Richard had miscalculated badly, and England was now on the verge of civil war. In November, Richard sent representatives to determine what the Lords wanted, and the Lords made it clear that Richard's 5 closest advisors must be tried for treason. On the 17th of November, the Lords rode in full armour to Westminster with 300 soldiers at the ready, where Richard sat on his elevated throne and listened. In the end, he agreed to a trial of these 5 men to be held on the 3rd of February, 1388. Although Henry supported this cause, for obvious reasons, he did not play an active role until he rode up to Westminster to meet with the king on the 17th of November. He had hesitated because likely he wanted permission from his father before fully participating, but once he had gained that permission, he played an active role. Having heard that a trial was coming, many of Richard's supporters deserted him. It was decided not to depose Richard because the messy question of the succession would come up again. Instead, they determined to destroy the resolve of Richard and his supporters by rounding them up and punishing them with a traitor's death. Their biggest threat came from Robert de Vere, the 9th Earl of Oxford, who had raised an army, and Henry was assigned to go after him. Through clever, swift action, the opposition forces managed to channel de Vere into a place where he could be captured. Henry and his men left the main group to circle around, trapping de Vere at Radgut Bridge near Oxford on the 19th of December. Realizing he had lost, de Vere slipped away and fled to Europe while his troops surrendered to Henry and his men. A week later, the opposition entered London, ready for war. A delegation with Henry, his uncle the Duke of Gloucester, along with the Earls Arundel, Warwick and Nottingham, met Richard in the Tower of London to negotiate. Although they did discuss deposition, it proved a messy topic, and the group chose to keep the status quo with only one change: that the ruling of Edward III regarding inheritance through the male line must remain in place. Richard had been muzzled for now, but the worst was yet to come. In February, the Lords Appellant, as the opposition was called, tried the traitors and sentenced most of them to death, even in absentia. What made this event most horrific was the fact that it was not the rule of law that ran this court of judgment, but military power and revenge. And so, it would come to be known as the Merciless Parliament for this reason. When Parliament met again in September, it had become clear to everyone that the Lords Appellant could not rule any better than the king, as they focused on their own needs and not those of the realm. By the following year, Richard had taken much of the government back. When the Royal Council meeting was called for the 3rd of May 1389, Henry, following his father's example of duty, was the only one of the appellants to attend. Richard removed all of the officers appointed by the appellants, and the inheritance issue remained unsettled, with the only accomplishment being that the Duke of Gloucester had not seized the throne, and Roger Mortimer was not the official heir. Henry left the meeting feeling dismayed, but his father would return to England in November 1389. Although battered, Henry had held his own while his father was away. Richard surprisingly welcomed John back with open arms, and even extended the Lancastrian Palatinate Duchy to John's heirs. When a chance came for Henry to demonstrate his military prowess overseas, he was granted permission to attend the jousting festival at Saint-Ongovert in France. In March 1390, he would be up against the best fighters from all of Europe. These were no ordinary encounters, because these were jousts of war, meaning the tips would not be blunted but sharpened so they could kill. Henry left England with many of his fellow nobles. He traveled into a different world where he met young men like himself who loved to celebrate life. He not only made lifelong friends, but also proved to Europe that he was one of the best fighters around. It was here he learned about going on crusades. It is important to point out here that the Crusades to the Holy Land had ended, but there still remained efforts to convert the infidel in places such as Tunis and Eastern Europe. He returned to England in May. He immediately set about planning his trip to the Tunis Crusades. Unfortunately, the King of France refused to grant his group permission to pass through his kingdom. Not wanting to put all of the preparation to waste, Henry chose instead to head east to Lithuania to assist the Knights of the Teutonic Order in their efforts to convert the Baltic pagans. He arrived in Poland on the 8th of August and made his way east to meet with the Teutonic forces. While there, Henry played a critical role in a skirmish on the River Wilia. He then assisted with the taking of the city of Vilnius, where he was able to place the banner of St. George on the parapet of the city, bringing glory to his English cohorts. He stayed and feasted at Königsberg through the winter. He returned to England in late March, having matured as a prince of the realm and having proven his skill as a warrior to all of Europe. When he attended Parliament in November 1391, tensions had not improved much since he had left over a year before. In fact, a third faction had formed around the Mortimer children because it had become clear that Richard had yet to produce an heir. More disturbing still were Richard's machinations to increase his power and his use of the division among the appellants to further weaken them. Controversy swirled on several fronts, from conflicts with the London merchants to a treaty with France, to the usual squabbles over inheritance and governmental power. So, when Henry received letters of protection on the 27th of June 1392 to travel east again, Henry leapt at the chance to get out of England. However, when he arrived, it turned out that the Crusades in Lithuania had ended. He remained in Danzig for a few weeks to decide his next move, which was to go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, as he wanted to visit Jerusalem. He used not only the fame of his grandfathers, but also his connections through marriages to smooth his way as he traveled south to Italy. He journeyed through Hammerstein, Frankfurt under Oder, Nisa, Gorlitz, Prague, Vienna, Klagenfurt, Villach, Treviso, and Venice. Along the way he met heads of state including King Wenceslas of Bohemia and King Sigismund of Hungary. At each stop, he took time to tour important sites, especially churches and cathedrals. He even received funding for his trip to Jerusalem from the Senate of the Venetian Republic. In December 1392, he set sail for Jerusalem. Arriving in Jaffa was an emotional experience for Henry, for he was now not only walking in the footsteps of his crusading ancestors, but also that of Christ. He embarked on the pilgrim's path to the holy city of Jerusalem. Once in the city, he toured the holy sites. He had done something that few English royals had ever done. Even Richard the Lionheart, who never actually entered the city of Jerusalem. He returned to Venice in March 1393, then crossed to Milan. From there, he made his way through France, charming the French court by telling them of his adventures. He arrived back in England on the 30th of June, 1393. Rather than being greeted warmly, Richard's supporters wanted to kill him, his father, and his uncle the Duke of Gloucester, because of rumors saying they were plotting to kill the king. When he was called to attend Parliament set for January 1394, he went reluctantly. After his father discovered he must go to Gascony to defend English rights there, he asked Richard to recognize Henry as the keeper of the realm in his stead as the heir apparent to Richard. The Mortimers protested, and the whole thing blew up. Next came the dispute over funding for John's travels. Henry left Parliament having seen the Lancastrians completely disparaged in public. Then Richard provided the ultimate insult. With John away to defend English rights in Gascony, Richard named Edmund, Duke of York, as the keeper of the realm, a public rebuke to the Lancastrians. Henry followed his father's example and put on a public face of support for his king, which he continued through the Parliament of January 1395 and the council meeting in July. The most significant thing that happened during that year was John Wycliffe pinned the 12 conclusions of the Lollards to the door at Westminster Abbey. Otherwise, the usual squabbles continued, and Henry did his best to protect his family's interests. John returned disappointed about the results in Gascony. He felt sick and concerned about the challenges facing his family. Henry wanted to leave England, and when an opportunity arose to serve in a war in Friesland, he began preparations only to be stopped by his father. In October 1396, both John and Henry attended the wedding celebration in Calais of Richard to his new wife after the death of Anna. She was the French king's daughter Isabella, and it was a splendid affair. Upon their return, Richard felt emboldened to begin attacking his enemies, especially the former lord's appellant, which included Henry. To make matters worse, in February 1397, Richard made his cousin, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, his, quote, brother, effectively announcing that the heir to the throne would pass through the York clan and not the Mortimer or the Lancaster families. Then came the rise of the counter-appellants, who systematically began to destroy the lord's appellant and their supporters. Henry had a choice: remain loyal to them or to the king. He chose to condemn his former conspirators to protect himself. Richard did not openly attack Henry or his friend Thomas de Mowbray, the 3rd Earl of Norfolk. Instead, he used psychological tactics. When it was announced that the Duke of Gloucester had been murdered, Henry felt real fear that Richard was not done with him yet. At the September 1397 Parliament, Richard declared that he was revoking all pardons for previous actions. He said he had a list of 50 traitors, but did not read the names. In order to produce the maximum amount of fear, he hoped that rash actions would rid the realm of his opponents. Then came death threats, confiscation of property, and banishment for those who remained. It became known as the Revenge Parliament. It was a slow, difficult march through terror, but Henry did his best to remain strong. Then came the bombshell that it was his friend Norfolk who had killed his uncle, but this was a lie. It had really been a man by the name of William Searle, Richard's valet, who had done the deed, but Henry would not learn that until years later. In exchange for their loyalty, both Mowbray and Henry were raised to dukedoms. However, Henry knew something was awry and purchased a bezoar stone to counteract poison. In December, Mowbray ran into Henry and told him that they were both in trouble because of their actions in 1387. Henry went immediately to his father to ask what to do. John reported what he had learned to Richard. The king declared that the only way to settle the matter was a joust to the death between Mowbray and Henry, and the date was set for September 1398. With all of the court in assembly, the two men, dressed in their best jousting regalia, prepared to begin battle in what was termed the Court of Chivalry. They were about to start when Richard called out, declaring that the joust be stopped. He then declared that Mowbray was to be banished for life, and Henry was to be banished for 10 years. Everything that John had worked for had been destroyed. They had all been played for fools. On the 13th of October 1398, Henry said goodbye to his father before he embarked from Dover to France to begin his exile. It would be the last time he would ever see his father. Unexpectedly, thousands arrived at the harbor, cheering to show their support before he sailed away, and it left him with a glimmer of hope that all was not lost. He was sympathetically welcomed into the French court, and worked to begin his new life. While the French felt sorry for this charming, talented young man, they were aware that he had been banished by his king for treason. So they embraced him warily. When news arrived of his father's death on the 3rd of February 1399, Henry was devastated. Then he learned that Richard had confiscated all of the Lancastrian lands for himself, and Henry had to make a choice. He could do nothing and waste away in exile, or he could act. Henry determined to engender support from others who had also been punished by the Revenge Parliament. The former Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas of Arundel, had learned of John's fate and left Utrecht to find Henry. Thomas's nephew, Thomas Fitzalan, also appeared ready to support Henry, and he had a loyal band of retainers who came with him into exile. Henry knew it was time to return to regain his birthright, so he created a deception. He thanked the French court for their generosity and explained that he must go to Spain. He requested the king's leave, which was granted. When he departed in July 1399, he headed west to maintain the deception and then turned north, touching the coastline periodically to confuse those trying to stop him from entering England. He landed at Spurn Head and headed to Pontefract Castle, arriving around the 14th of July, 1399. From there, he greeted supporters that had been amassing in Doncaster. While all that Henry wanted was the return of his ancestral lands, the moment had come to grab something larger, and it looked like he had the support to do it. However, his allies, especially the Earl of Northumberland and his son Hotspur, demanded he promise them two key things. First, he would not take the throne by force, and second, he had to find a way to disempower Richard. As they moved west, Henry's supporters continued to appear. Richard's followers gave way to Henry's growing army. The king arrived in Wales from Ireland and headed to Carmarthen with his soldiers. Here could have been the decisive moment when Henry had to choose loyalty to king or treason demanding justice. Yet Richard answered that question by abandoning his army at Carmarthen. Even Richard's adopted brother threw in his support with Henry. The Dukes of Exeter and Surrey, some of the few lords who had remained loyal to the king, met Henry in Chester. They told Henry that Richard was prepared to forgive his past actions in exchange for disbanding his army. Henry smiled, then detained them. Henry's team devised a plan to lure Richard out of his hiding place, and Richard believed the deception. He was captured and taken to Flint Castle, where he refused to eat. Richard was then moved to London because Parliament had been called to meet. When Henry entered London, he asked the mayor what he wanted him to do with Richard, and was told to take him to Westminster. So he did. Henry then marched triumphantly through London to St. Paul's Cathedral and prayed at the high altar there. He would need guidance for what was to come next. He then gathered together a team of lawyers to help him determine what he could do now in terms of the deposition of Richard and his legal right of inheritance. It was decided that he would use his dual lineage to King Henry III, rather than Edward III, to claim right of inheritance. Then, Richard would have to voluntarily abdicate the throne, signing a document as proof. At first, Richard refused to sign when told this by Henry's representatives, but once he had Henry before him to discuss things, he agreed to sign the document of abdication, only asking if he could have an income sufficient enough to be well maintained. The deed was done. The next day, Parliament met. After all of the legal niceties about birthrights, line of succession, and the nature of Richard's abdication had been addressed, the Parliament proceeded to vote Henry to become king. Then, the Archbishop of York and the soon-to-be reinstated Archbishop of Canterbury walked Henry up to the throne. Henry bent on one knee, and prayed before taking his seat. It was a momentous occasion, and England had a new king. His coronation took place on the 13th of October 1399. One of Henry's first acts was to create a new honorary knighthood, the Order of the Bath, and he proceeded to knight over 50 men. The next day at Parliament, he fulfilled his obligation to his supporters by first repealing the rulings of the Revenge Parliament and reinstating those of the Merciless Parliament. He then declared to the prelates that he would work to address heresy in the realm. He would also use the funds from his Lancastrian holdings to pay for his expenses, at least for now. His goal was to rule as his grandfather Edward III had done. Events would play against this hope because of endless funding issues and numerous rebellions against his rule. In the end, he did everything he could to protect his kingdom and to keep his dynasty safe. Many in Parliament assumed it was time to take revenge on those who had enabled Richard's tyranny. While some were brought to justice, most were given leniency, which shocked the members of Parliament. It was during these trials that Henry learned who gave the order to kill his uncle and how he died. The next big question was what to do with Richard. Henry wanted to consult not only with the lawyers, but also with the prelates to determine the best course of action. They decided to remove Richard to Pontefract and to keep him under guard for now. For the counter-appellants, they also received the king's mercy. Henry felt pleased by his performance, but he would feel the wrath of his generosity soon enough. Former counter-appellants of their supporters met secretly at Westminster in December to plan a revolt against Henry. Their objective was to assassinate him, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Henry's 4 sons on the 4th of January, 1400. The plot was foiled when Edward, Richard's adopted brother, dined with his father, the Duke of York, and happened to leave the written version of the plan on the table. When his father discovered it, he confronted his son, and they agreed to betray the plot. Once Henry learned about this, he acted quickly and rounded up the conspirators. In the end, 26 men were beheaded and 6 received a traitor's death. Some received mercy, including John Farrar, who had saved Henry's life back in 1381. This plot came to be known as Epiphany Rising. It had far-reaching implications. Poor Henry now realized how naive he had been. He also knew that keeping Richard alive was dangerous. No one knows how Richard died, but we do know that he was dead by the 14th of February 1400, probably from starvation. Events continued to conspire against Henry's dream of being a just warrior king. The root of much of his troubles over the next 5 years was lack of money. While initially he used his own Lancastrian wealth, that ran out quickly enough. Consecutive parliaments demanded that Henry cut his household expenses and address other excessive expenditures. Just as they blamed bad advisors for the financial shortfalls under Richard, they did the same for Henry. But he allowed new people to be placed in roles of responsibility, even though it meant removing long-time friends from key positions. He also did what he could to cut expenditures, but one thing he would not cut were annuities, as he felt that would be a betrayal of trust. Financial pressures grew as Scotland, Wales, and Ireland rebelled. The French allied themselves with one or more of these countries, threatened to invade Calais, Gascony, or even England, and ran a shipping proxy war known as the Pirates' War to damage shipping. There were a series of bad harvests and the collapse of the wool trade that led to financial shortfalls and increased commodity prices due to food shortages. He also had to keep up the appearance of a lavish royal court. In addition, the church put pressure on Henry to stamp out heresy. In February 1401, the prelates sent a petition to the king to address the heretic William Sartre, who had been arrested, tried, and found guilty of heresy. The 1401 Parliament passed the De Heretic Comburendo that authorized the burning of heretics. Sartre met his fate in March 1401, the first person to be burned at the stake in England. The second was John Badby, guilty of Lollardism, who was burned in 1410. The Parliament of 1401 did grant a tax after thoroughly embarrassing Henry about his difficult financial situation. Yet, the money could not be collected because the tax collectors were attacked, even murdered. People felt Henry had betrayed them by imposing new taxes during peacetime, despite rebellions in Wales and Scotland, as well as numerous French threats. Henry's confessor, Philip Repington, dared to draft a report to Henry that explained just how bad things had become. If the harsh demands of Parliament had not woken Henry to the fact that the world had changed from the warrior king ideal, this report did. Henry took immediate action to begin making changes, becoming more directly involved in the functioning of government and utilizing his family, including his young sons, more directly in managing the realm, by placing his first son Henry with Hotspur to address issues in Wales, and his second son Thomas in Ireland. While these new efforts helped, Parliament tied his hands by not providing enough money to do the work properly, with Henry's sons' letters back to their father being filled with requests for more money. In addition to all of this chaos, assassination attempts on Henry and rumors that Richard was still alive continued fomenting additional rebellions. For any threat, including military, all Henry could afford were quick incursions to calm things down for a time, as he just did not have the money for more. Soldiers battling rebellions in Scotland and Wales began to grumble about back pay, and Henry's troubles kept multiplying. Henry's main antagonist was a Welsh nobleman, Owain Glendower, or Owain Glyndŵr in Welsh, who turned against England, declaring himself Prince of Wales, beginning his rebellion in 1400. Although Henry did his best to control it, he could accomplish little without money. In 1402, Edmund Mortimer was captured during the Battle of Brynglas. Henry decided to send 3 armies into Wales in a 3-pronged approach to destroy the Welsh rebellion, but he only allowed 2 weeks for the effort, and it was a dismal failure. The only good news that year was the victory at the Battle of Homildon Hill in September over the Scots. Yet, trouble was brewing. Hotspur increasingly resented not being reimbursed for his growing military expenses. He and his family also felt that Henry had not lived up to his promises at Lancaster. In other words, Henry could not be manipulated by them. The Percy family determined it was time to overthrow Henry, and joined forces with Glendower and Edmund Mortimer, who had become a Glendower supporter after his capture. Henry first became aware of the growing threat of this rebellion on the 12th of July 1403, as he marched to address issues in the north. He acted quickly, sending troops to Shrewsbury to establish a foothold there, hoping to trap Hotspur, who was amassing a major force against him. The 2 armies arrived in Shrewsbury on the 20th of July, and the next morning the 2 armies clashed in what is still considered one of the bloodiest battles in English history. For Henry, it proved a decisive victory, resulting in Hotspur's death and the temporary weakening of Glendower's rebellion. Parliament even granted him the right to tax, which was a small win, but an important one, and Henry received a much-needed gift in July 1404 in the form of the capture of William Searle, the man who had killed the Duke of Gloucester. This provided the perfect opportunity to finally end rumors that Richard still lived, because Searle had stolen Richard's signet ring and now even the French knew that Richard was clearly dead. Henry had another success during the 1404 October Parliament. Henry's officials made it clear that the king could do nothing regarding Wales and other challenges unless he had the revenue to address it. In order to raise more funds, serious measures had to be taken, and they offered some solutions. For one, all temporalities of the church should be confiscated, which pleased the Commons immensely. Secondly, all ancient inheritances of the crown, dating from the reign of Edward III, should be rebuilt from resources found in royal castles, lands, and related fees. They proposed that a commission be established to process these records to determine what revenues could be pulled from these resources. The Parliament was so pleased by these ideas that they granted the king a generous tax, renewed the wool subsidy for 2 years, and increased the income tax on nobles to 5%. It was a major victory orchestrated by Henry's key advisor, Thomas of Arundel, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry continued to defend the realm as best he could, and his son Henry was able to defeat Glendower at Grosmont in March 1405. The French attacked Calais but were beaten back with the use of England's skillful archers. Then, as Henry moved towards Wales, he was informed that a rebellion was forming near Scotland in what would become known as the Yorkshire Rising. Northumberland, Thomas de Mowbray, 4th Earl of Norfolk, and Sir Thomas Bardolph had rebelled against the king as well as the Archbishop of York, Richard Scrope, who had amassed an army in Shipton Moor. Henry's army, led by the Duke of Westmoreland and Henry's third son John, resoundingly defeated this rebellion. Northumberland fled into Scotland, but others were not so lucky, as Henry was not in the mood to be merciful this time, and he gave the order to execute the Archbishop after he had been found guilty of treason. This action sent shockwaves throughout Christendom, yet Henry felt it necessary to assure the safety of the realm. On the 8th of June 1405, the day of Scrope's execution, Henry woke up screaming, "Traitors, traitors, you have thrown fire over me." He had red pustules all over his body and was extremely sick. Some thought it was divine vengeance for executing an archbishop. It instead was a mysterious illness that would slowly weaken and kill him over the next 8 years. It had similar symptoms to the disease that had killed the Black Prince. The Parliament in March 1406 dealt with critical issues. First, they discussed succession because clearly the king was ill and no one knew how long he might live. Second, they began to pull more power towards themselves, substantially weakening royal power by handing most of the decision-making role to the council. It issued the 31 Articles, spelling out what the king could and could not do and what power the council had. It was an important precedent, but it worried Henry of Lancaster for this very reason, since he wondered what would happen to his power when he assumed his role as king. During the debate over taxation, Thomas of Arundel, Henry's chief advisor, pointed out that it was the king who agreed to refrain from expenditures for a year in order to get things back on track, but blaming the king for the financial constraints could no longer apply. It was Parliament who had to solve the problem. The king had already done what he could. It proved a decisive moment in the changing relationship between the king and his government. Yet, rebellions continued. Northumberland, however, would not give up. He again raised the standard of rebellion against Henry. On the 15th of February 1408, the rebellion forces met Henry's army at Bramham Moor and were defeated, with Northumberland killed during the battle. In 1409, Henry's army crushed Glendower's forces at Harlech Castle, and Glendower fled into the hills and disappeared. Family matters and his legacy began to occupy more of Henry's thoughts. One troubling event started in 1410, when his eldest son began to move into the power vacuum, itching to take more control for himself. He even pushed Arundel aside to further this process, and some spoke of deposition. But even so, Henry had kept abreast of events. He chose to intervene when his son and council determined that, to make up the financial shortfall, they would go after the annuities. Henry, throughout his reign, had refused to hurt people who relied on these funds to survive. Now his son had made a grave mistake, and Henry began to reassert himself. He attended the 1411 Parliament, where he stated clearly that he wanted no novelties, meaning he did not want to discuss abdication. He then asked the members of the council to come before the throne and thanked them for their service. What he had just done was dismiss them so he could re-establish control over the government. His actions infuriated his son. After a few months he had calmed down. On the 29th of July 1411, Henry entered his father's chamber and knelt before him. He begged forgiveness and then handed his father his dagger and said, "My lord and father, my life is not so dear to me that I would live one day that I should be in your displeasure. I forgive you my death." Henry the king tossed away the dagger, embraced his son, and cried. Henry attended his final parliament on the 1st of December 1412 and spent the Christmas holiday in the embrace of his family. It was obvious he was not well. In January, he was taken to Lambeth to receive the best care. Everyone held their breath and wondered when the time would come. On the 21st of February 1413, they moved Henry to Westminster Abbey. He attempted to make an offering at the shrine of St. Edward the Confessor, but collapsed, unconscious. He had wanted to die in Jerusalem, but that was not going to happen now. They picked him up off the floor and moved him into the abbot's chamber. When he awoke, Henry did not recognize where he was, and the chamberlain told him he was in the Jerusalem chamber. He died on the 20th of March 1413, thinking of the Holy Land. They waited until his son Thomas could return from defending Gascony for the funeral. Henry was buried on the 18th of June 1413 in Trinity Chapel in Canterbury Cathedral, as he had requested. He had taken England through a turbulent time, but left the kingdom in better shape than he had found it, and in the capable hands of his eldest son and his brothers, he had achieved what he set out to do, to heal his troubled homeland. What do you think of King Henry IV? Was he a good king, or is he deserving of his bad reputation? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.